So we're in the air now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our now regular, almost weekly virtual meetup gathering by Large Scale Scrum community of New York City. We also have people joining us from all over the globe, which makes us now no longer a local community, but a global community. This session will be recorded at permission of the speaker, Isaac Sikolik, who is in the studio with us today. Before I pass it on to Isaac, I would like to give a quick word of introduction to him. He is the best-selling author, top 100 social, CIO, CDO, and digital transformation influencer. He is a specialist in Agile, DevOps, data science, and other disciplines. He has held multiple CIO positions at a number of organizations, including McGraw-Hill and Company Construction Division. In fact, I had the pleasure of meeting Isaac back almost a decade ago at the above-mentioned company. Today, Isaac is the founder and the president of Star CIO, a services company that guides clients' success with data and technology while executing smarter, faster, and more innovative transformation programs. Isaac is also the publisher, and his best-selling book is actually displayed on the screen, Driving Digital. Without any further ado, I would like to pass the baton over to Isaac and ask him to share some of his experiences in the world of technology and business and innovation. And he will be leveraging some of large-scale Scrum experiments that we have well documented for more than a decade, although they will be described and spoken from a standpoint of someone who did not necessarily adopt or practice large-scale Scrum. So it would be interesting to hear from someone who has done in a very framework, knowledge agnostic way. Without any further ado, I will pass it on to Isaac. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat room. I will be monitoring the room, and I will be getting Isaac's attention onto those questions as he goes through his presentation. Isaac.
Thank you, Gene. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's here. Gene, thanks for having me on the program. Always excited to speak to other Agile enthusiasts, leaders, coaches, practitioners, team leads, product owners, Scrum Masters, everybody who wants to change the world one sprint or one user story at a time. Just, highlighting some things from my background. I actually started my career as a software developer and a data scientist. So it was fairly hands-on building software for a good chunk of my career. And, I got into the CTO role of startups, and then later on as a CIO at a fashionably young age, and was, been doing things with, helping organizations build software and build analytics out, helping organizations that are not technology companies, but require technology and data in particular to be able to compete in a digital world. And so, that's the perspective that I come sharing some of my experiences with everybody here. As Gene said, I've been practicing Agile probably informally since about 2000 and more formally since about 2008. I'm familiar with many of the frameworks that are out there and many of the practices and methodologies out there, but I'm not schooled in large-scale Scrum or other programs. I tend to use programs that I have built up over time that have made me successful. And I do a lot of writing and speaking around about that. My blog, Social, Agile, and Transformation, that's blogs.starcio.com. I started that over 12 years ago because somebody said to me I should plug into the blogosphere. And I didn't know what that meant, so I started writing about what I was learning as a software developer. And my very first post was about how developers need to log more and better information in their log files. And so if you look at the blog, you'll see at least, I would say, about a third of the posts are touching Agile, because I do believe Agile is the backbone for changing organizations and for executing. In my book, Driving Digital, it's actually the second chapter, because again, I strongly believe that this is what organizations have to do to evolve and get the collaboration they need to be successful. And then over the last few years, I've been writing about it on CIO.com and on Infoworld.com, including other articles around DevOps and other related areas. So when I talked to Gene, I looked through your experiments, and I picked out a handful that my understanding and my programs tend to touch a lot on, specifically on the front end in terms of working with product organizations and product management. Then going into how do you take big ideas and brainstorm them down into, what's the design of the user experience, what's the APIs that you're going to create, what's the data model, and then how do you think about partnering with testers and programmers, and today more increasingly operators who are part of Scrum teams and are charged not just with writing code and delivering it, but over its overall quality, its ongoing improvement, its operational stability. And then thinking about how to be efficient, about how to actually release software on a regular basis and act like a software company. So, if you take one slide away from this presentation, it's going to be this one. I'm going to be talking about continuous planning as a way of balancing what you're doing with your product organizations and using feedback on a regular basis. I'm going to share some insights around agile estimation, at least the programs that I endorse and that I share with my clients and through my readership. And I'm going to talk a little bit about DevOps as a way of getting testing and security and operations into the scope of what you put into your Agile program. But I want to start with a little story. And the funny thing, Gene, is this is actually, I will share with this group, this is a construction story. And this actually happened to me as the CIO of construction. I was about 2 months into the job. I had inherited, like other CIOs, a mound of technologies and legacy and integrations that were sneaker netted all over the place, and a team that had its heart in executing, but didn't have the practices to do that. And about 2 months in, a product manager came in one day when my son was in the office. He was sitting there, he was 6 years old at the time, playing with his iPad, trying to keep busy, while I was trying to look over some architecture diagrams. And so this product manager comes in to see me, which I thought was pretty interesting. Usually I don't get a visit from product early on. And he says to me, Isaac, tell me what the roadmap is for this product. And so I listened to him and I said, geez, I'm just getting this team to think about executing and understanding the very basics of Agile and how to do stand-ups and how to do demos. And here comes this guy and he's asking me for roadmaps. And so I gave him a long answer about where the team was and what I was thinking about. And I probably spewed a lot of technical jargon for a while. And he came back to me and said, okay, I get it, Isaac, but where's your roadmap? And so I kept on giving him different answers, trying to give him a sense of what the roadmap was, but really beating around the bush, because the real situation was I didn't have a roadmap. I was 2 months into this job. I was just trying to get Agile running in the organization. But unbeknownst to me, my son was listening to this and all he heard was roadmap, roadmap, roadmap. And so he turned around. I lost track of what he was doing. I turned around and here he is on the whiteboard and he's scribbling on it and saying, Daddy, here's your roadmap. The most simple answer of drawing on the whiteboard and saying, there's got to be an easier way to come back to my dad, and in my case, go back to the organization and take something that is a fundamental practice that we all know works. We get teams to execute in small sprints, like sprint-sized bites and user story-sized requirements, and trying to get a bigger picture story in terms of what we're working on. So like I said, this was, something that I had been thinking about 3 or 4 years ago when I had realized that transformation was hitting most organizations at different speeds at different times. I was working in media companies that got hit with transformation very early on, and we had to do things very differently. Construction was a little bit of a laggard, it's a laggard industry, and then I worked in financial services, and now I have clients in nonprofit, in associations, in fintech, in manufacturing and supply chain, just about all over the place. And every one of them has to get smarter and faster. So the book came out a couple years ago. It was really a best practice guide in terms of what organizations need to have to be able to execute transformation programs. And again, chapter 2 is the Agile chapter. So I'm going to share some insights with you around that. You could see it right here, how to understand Agile practices, how to think about planning, how do you get organizations to think about an MVP, what do release life cycles go through. Those are the things that I cover actually in the book. So why Agile? Why are we talking about Agile as the backbone for really running transformations? Now, most organizations and groups, when you say Agile, they immediately veer off the Scrum methodologies. And when they veer into Scrum methodologies, this is the picture most companies and people will have, right? A very basic Scrum process. You have a sprint, you're doing planning up front, you're doing daily stand-ups, you're doing a review at the end of it, and you're doing retrospectives. And the heart of why this works is a number of things that you all know very well. Number one, you get the team to focus on a small part of their backlog. Number two, they are actually committing to the work that they are doing. They're not being told what work has to be done. Number three, there's very lightweight communications built into this in terms of stand-ups and really focusing on things like user stories with acceptance criteria. So there's a clear and shared understanding of what people need to deliver. You share that with your stakeholders, with your product owners, even in some cases your customers, so you can get very early feedback, and then you go off and do your retrospective for process improvement, all the things that we know about. But yet this is, for most of us, a sprint is a week, 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks at most. We're looking at a very narrow window of time that you're applying to be able to go and do execution on a very short basis. So as a CIO, I think about this from that perspective. How do I make teams successful? But I also have to think about how to make the organization successful. And so I could tell the CEO, I could tell the CFO, the head of strategy, the head of sales, anything I want about what we're doing around Agile. But at the end of the day, they need to know what's coming down the pike, whether it's on a quarterly basis or on a release basis. They need to understand where the organization is going. When I work with my technologists, they wrestle with, how much should a team be empowered to select tools, to really self-organize in terms of what they're building from a technology perspective, and where standards are really important. And so, if you're not a startup and you don't have a lot of legacy, if you are a startup and you don't have a lot of legacy, you can afford to be very sided to self-organizing teams and letting them figure out what technologies to use. But if you're in an enterprise with a lot of legacy and a lot of teammates to train and to set best practices on, you really need to think about what technology standards to put in place and where there's self-organization and where there's standards. I think about not just getting code out the door and in the hands of end users and customers. I think about the reliability of the releases. And one of the metrics that I typically track is, not how often you release, but how often you release without having to go back and do emergency break fixes or hot fixes or patches to fix things that inadvertently got into the production environment. And lastly, I think about winning teams, right? Every organization I know has too many things that they're trying to do. They're over allocated. There's too much demand for technology and data. They tend to get very stressed in terms of what they're delivering. And over time, that stress builds up with them. So I constantly think about, how do we celebrate the wins of the teams? How do we make them champions? But also, how do we self-improve at the same time? The three things that I think that are terribly important to do around this come down to three things. Coming up with your principles, starting with how you interpret the Agile Manifesto and what principles are important to your organization. Every organization is different in terms of how they think about speed and quality, in terms of what is innovative to them, and what's important to them. So I think it's very important to come back with principles. I think it's also important to come back with what your operating model is. How do you handle defects? What should developers do if there's a production issue? How much quality and security testing is minimally required? These are all things that need to go into the operating model. And then coming up with what you mean by a DevSecOps culture. And what I mean by that is I am trying to get not only new innovation out to market, but also how to do that reliably, and how to develop systems that scale. I know I have multiple teams with multiple teammates of different skills to be able to do that, and they need to collaborate on both sides of that equation. So that to me is a big part of what agile planning is corresponding to. And this is essentially how you do it. Number one, you're planning every sprint. You're not just actually delivering code every sprint. Number two, you're using estimation as a conversation between stakeholders, product, and the team that's executing to share information about what is more complicated and what requires more effort. And when I explain this to teams and I explain this to product owners, the secret to getting to a discussion of what an MVP is to be able to be very clear about value proposition and very clear about what the estimates are to actually go out and build it. And so one of the examples I typically use in one of my workshops is login, right? If you think about a simple login experience, it's a username, it's password, it's remember me, it's forget password, maybe it's some admin tools to help users who have forgotten their password. And then there's a whole bunch of other things we think about today, whether it's two-factor authentication, it's single sign-on, it's social logins. And so if I were building this today, which I don't advocate necessarily, but if I were building it, I would be having a conversation about what that minimal requirement is. How do we think about privacy and security around this? What kind of volumes of registrations we have to manage, and all of that factors into not only what the most important things are from a value perspective, but how the teams estimate in terms of what it's going to take to accomplish it. I think about releases. I wrote a post about 3 years ago that said that even if you have built CI/CD and you have automation and you have great continuous testing, should you be releasing every day or every week? And is that what your end users want? And is that what your business requires? And I argue that most organizations probably should be doing more traditional release management, where they think about major releases and minor releases and system upgrades, because they often don't have all the automation they think they do. And even if they do, it may not be what the business requires or what end users want. And then lastly, I think about end-to-end monitoring, right? So you've done your planning, you've done your estimation and your delivery, you've done release planning, and now you're actually putting something into production. How do you monitor this thing to get the right level of feedback for you to go back and prioritize what you're doing next? So that's the framework. What this looks like in a little bit more detail to share with this group. Agile delivery is what most teams are most focused on. So how do you take your backlog and you go execute and build software out, build testing out, build documentation out, hopefully do demos that delight stakeholders, and hopefully do this on a continual basis where you have a happy team delivering software. I then think about deployment, everything from how to make sure this thing is working in production. How do I make SRE successful diagnosing issues? What kind of automation I'm putting into my cloud environment? What types of reports and feedback that I'm coming back with? Whether or not customers are satisfied, and I'm doing surveys to make sure of that. Can I do more incremental releases with things like feature flagging? So going into that area, being able to deploy. Then coming backwards and going back and saying, how do we have a better partnership with the business in terms of what is the MVP? And most importantly, can I get a backlog that's more than one sprint deep? So I know you're all agile practitioners. I want you to think about how many of your teams are able to get more than one sprint a backlog, fully estimated, fully ready to go, and get to an actual roadmap coming off of that, and using reports like Burndowns and other KPIs to give the business an indication of where the teams are going. And then moving back up to be able to address those business needs, thinking through how to use design thinking, how to use architecture as an advantage, where you're prioritizing technical debt and spikes in addition to the features that are being required. How do you write better requirements so that there's a better understanding of acceptance criteria, and then later on, how do you actually estimate? So this to me is the end-to-end process around agile release management. It's not just about coding in the delivery. It's not just about how do you take that code and pushing it into production. I call that deployment. I call this the entire end-to-end process from the very day that you have a vision to go out and actually do a release. You start planning it, you partner with the business in terms of what you're going to focus on. You actually work on both delivery and planning at the same time, and then you go out and deploy to this. So I'm going to share one know-how from the book and from my workshops. You might be asking, well, how does this work in practice? And so there's two pieces to this. Uh, Most of you are probably doing some form of vision statement with your stakeholders and product owners. Most tools will allow you to capture epics, features, and stories. And then you're starting to get into the question of how many stories can I get done in a sprint? How many stories can I get done in a release? And how to think about actually getting that information back to our product owners to make good prioritization decisions. So I break down story writing into two steps. The first step I called stubbing, and that basically is what it sounds like. I'm taking a feature and I'm creating an itemized list of stubs. Those are the summaries for a story. And I'm working with a technical lead and the product owner. And if you have a business analyst alongside with them, to come back and say, this feature is probably these 5 stubs. Login has captured username and password. It's encryption of the password. It's storage in a database. It's a forget password function, however your team ends up stubbing it out. And then I asked the technical lead, not the team. I asked the technical lead then to give me an estimate around those stubs. Now that sounds a little bit dangerous to a lot of technical leads who want to see requirements, who might even want to see designs and architecture before they start putting estimates in. But I want to give feedback really early on back to that product owner. And I want to make sure that when they give me a requirement that's probably more than I can deliver, that I can give them some feedback and say, this feature is 15 stories. Here's 5 of them that are 13 or 21 points, and hopefully enable them to make better decisions about, maybe what's in the MVP, or maybe how to reduce the requirements around something so that I don't end up with big stories that are hard to manage and hard to deliver on. The intention of those stubs and estimates is to filter down to what's truly required. And then I can go off and do story writing on the ones that I know that are going to be prioritized for the upcoming release. So that's a fraction of the number of stories that were stubbed. And at that point, I throw out the estimate. They're no longer valid. I go back to the team. I ask them to size it. And those are the sizes that I use for commitment and velocity. Okay, so again, a 2-step process here. By doing this, what I find is teams can take epics, break them down to features and stubs, and get a much longer backlog of at least stubs. They want to get ahead of that. There's a partnership with product to be able to do that so that they can get a better sense of the cost and complexity about what they're asking for. That gives the development teams, business analysts, technical leads more time to really focus on story writing. I was supposed to do a keynote around this or a talk at the Atlassian conference in a few weeks. Like other conferences, that one has gone virtual. So for those of you who are on JIRA, I thought I'd share a little bit of insight in terms of how Star CIO implements this in JIRA. For the first thing, we actually introduce a new issue type called planning. And so in any single backlog, much like there's features and stories, in particular, you're committing to stories at every sprint. I'm also asking teams to commit to planning every sprint. And so planning basically is what it sounds like. It's taking an idea, which could be at an epic or a feature level, and it's then breaking it down either into stubs or actually going into story writing. So the art of building the backlog up is captured on the backlog as planning items or planning issue types. There's some JIRA isn't great around hierarchy around this. So I've found some ways to work with that in terms of using parent-child links, and then also using a feature board to be able to capture the features and the level of detail around them. In terms of structure and getting into releases, again, I'm more traditional in terms of focusing on major and minor releases, allowing epics to span multiple releases, but instructing product owners and their tech leads to use a definition that a feature must be delivered in a release. And so that creates a common understanding of what a feature is. It bounds it. It still might have multiple stories associated with it, but a feature is a bite-sized chunk in terms of what you're trying to get to market. In terms of workflow, this mimics the workflow I shared on the previous slide. So when you conceive of a new story, it's first stubbed and estimated. It then gets storied, which basically means write the requirements, get the full design in, get the acceptance criteria in, and then go to the team to size it. And then we can actually start delivery, which is essentially where the team is actually working on it. So you can actually update your workflow in JIRA to be able to support this. And then one of the things I work with most of my teams, I love some of the reporting in it in JIRA. I even like some of the reporting in Azure DevOps. But what I find is to really get into a better understanding of what you're delivering and what you're planning, I tend to pull the data out, integrate it with other systems and other reporting systems, and build some dashboards out to give more holistic pictures of what's going on. So this is a use case of using a Tableau plugin that connects to Atlassian, pulls out all the JIRA metrics, and allows building some better reporting on the versions, the epics, and the sprints. That's a dashboard that you're seeing up in front of you. So just a way of implementing the entire end-to-end process I just described. I'm going to cut short from getting into too much on DevOps, but there was one of our topics that I had put up for the group is around release management. And so if you look at my new series, it's called 5 Minutes with NY Ike. It's on YouTube. You can get to the channel called through my URL, starcio.com/5NYIke. And the first episode was on agile planning, so you can get a little bit more on what I just walked through. The second one is on DevOps. And what I talk about in this episode is how unfortunate the name DevOps is. If I go to the CEO and I say I want my organization to be agile and follow agile practices, that sounds like a pretty positive thing to me. It's an easy sell. Nobody wants rigidity. Everybody wants to be able to pivot and listen to feedback and listen to customers and adjust what you're prioritizing. But if I say I'm investing time on DevOps or putting CI/CD in place or being able to scale out multiple environments with infrastructure as code, or then talk about how do I shift left testing or how do I shift left security, the only people who truly understand that are the technologists. And so it is an unfortunate name. But for those of us who are working in this space, I think we all can understand that DevOps must include testing, right? Someone asked me the other day, how do I align agile teams that have developers in one team and testers on another team? And my simple answer to that person was, you don't. That's not a best practice anymore. And you try to get everybody who is focused on delivery and quality on the same team together. I just did 2 articles for InfoWorld, one on shift left testing, a second one on shift left security. They should be fairly easy to find on InfoWorld, but a lot of details that I researched on tools and best practices on moving testing and security left into the development process. And you can certainly ping me on Twitter, my handle, NYIKE, NYIKE. And if you can't find those articles, I'll post them on Twitter for you. Again, most of my writing on 3 different places, my blog, blogs.starcio.com, InfoWorld, and also on CIO. If you go to the URL it's actually starcio.com. It's the wrong URL. It's starcio.com/LessInNYC. You'll be able to sign up for my newsletter. And from that newsletter, I share it monthly. I post all my articles there for you to go look at. So again, it's starcio.com/LessInNYC. And then just a little bit of some of the things that I do as a business. I find that to take Agile, to take DevOps, and to take data beyond the practitioners, right? So get it beyond the developers, beyond the testers, the engineers, and the data scientists, and to get to a holistic end-to-end collaboration between business, hands-on practitioners, and the ability to work with customers and end users when you complete something. It really is a new way of working for many organizations. And so I do workshops, I do consulting, I have a set of digital guides and training to help organizations really think how to instrument these programs. The leadership and transformation ones are ones that I do with executive groups, product management groups, in terms of how they interface with Agile teams. With practitioners, I tend to do a multidisciplinary group around product and Agile and data. And then when it comes to DevOps, I'm usually bringing in the Agile developers, the testers, and operations to do a DevOps and IT transformation workshop. So that's a little bit about me and what I do and around Agile planning. I do have a white paper on this. You can get it from the URL up there, starcio.com/agile-transformation. And Gene, I think we have some time to take questions. Right on time, just like I
Sure.
said, 35 minutes.
Indeed, I think you were planning to finish at 12:35. So we actually do have a few collected. I have a few that were pinged to me directly, and a few were pinged in the shared chat.
Awesome.
So let me, so a couple of, let me just read off the top. Let me just give you all 5, and then I'll go back and you can pick and choose which one you want to start first. How have you used agility to move away from roadmaps into formulation of hypotheses-based decision-making and alignment to metrics performance-based delivery? One. Second one, tech leads and BAs in agile organization. What does it mean? You
Okay.
sub minimal viable story. Kind of make maybe you can align the term stub, which is pretty technical term, with a minimal viable story. What does release automation have to do with what customers want? Could you please explain more? And there's one more that actually came directly to me. JIRA discussions and workflows. What does it have to do with organizational agility and large-scale Scrum? So I'm actually going to take it up on myself. So Isaac has been invited here to speak as someone I have known for years. So he may not necessarily be well aware of large-scale Scrum, its principles, rules, guides, and experiments. So let's just give him an opportunity to explain, but maybe the question is valid and you want to address it. So those 5.
Okay. Let me see if I could take this in order. I think I want to start with the second question on BAs and tech leads and try to answer it this way. And again, Gene, like you said, I am understanding of large scale Scrum. I'm not a practitioner on it or a coach. So what I'm going to answer to your questions are from my vantage point. Hopefully it helps you in your thinking. But there's a couple things that happen in Agile that I think about. The manifesto talks about product owner and team, right? And it provides a very specific role for the product owner in terms of prioritizing backlogs and writing stories and accepting them. And the team is there to work as a collaborative group, multidisciplinary, to go out and execute around them. The first thing I think about when I bring this to larger organizations, organizations particularly doing customer-facing software applications, customer being actual customers, not just enterprise applications. When I think about where they are coming from in their understanding of how to write requirements and what their actual job functions are. And so that what I'm trying to say is that most organizations don't have enough skilled product owners to actually do Agile as well as we'd like them to do. When they also have a lot of other job responsibilities other than servicing the teams. And so when that happens, particularly when you're doing a lot of more heavy lifting technology oriented work, business analysts can play a role of writing stories and acting as a pseudo product owner to help the product owner write stories and requirements in a way that's digestible to teams. I have found that it's particularly useful for teams that are distributed or maybe working with offshore models and need to get a little bit more technically specific around what goes into a story. So that's the answer around BA. In terms of tech lead, technical leads are usually play different roles. One of them in my framework, in the STAR CIO Agile planning framework, they are charged with doing the first round of estimating. So that's not done by the team, it's done by the tech lead. I want the tech lead having and coordinating the discussion with the team in terms of how things are implemented. I think the technical lead needs to know and understand where the strengths and weaknesses from a skill perspective of their team, and how to work around technical blocks and other impediments that come up during the sprint. So that's my definition of technical lead that I use in Driving Digital on my blog. Gene, there was a question about experimenting and around a minimal viable story. Okay, I'm going to try to answer both
Sure.
both of those at the same time.
Those comments, please.
Yeah. So my word of experimenting, I'm not sure I'm going to use the same way that it's used in large scale Scrum, but my word of experimenting is essentially everything that you are putting in front of end users, customers, and stakeholders is in fact an experiment. We used to think, or some of us used to be delusional, that we knew exactly what end users want and that we could write really good requirements and that developers and engineering teams could go follow a BRD and write really good software. And so what we all know is that that's no longer the case, right? We cannot write that well requirements. We need to learn. We need to experiment and hear and get results back from the community in terms of how and what we're building. So whether it's a feature, whether it's a new release that you're putting to market, I think it's the right way to look at this is that you're always putting out experiments. Some of those experiments, if you have the right technologies in places, you can actually release to a subset of your users. You can do that with technologies called feature flagging that allows turning on a particular feature for a subset of users. Other times you're turning it on for everybody and trying to see what resonates with them, what do they use, what kind of feedback you're getting from them. So I think everything that we're putting out into a release is actually an experiment. Tied to that is someone asked a minimal viable story. I don't use that language. I mean, stub to me is not a story. It's a one-line synopsis of what will go into that story. Its audience is essentially two people, the product owner and the technical lead and a business analyst if you have one on the team. So it has a minimal scope in terms of what we're trying to address there. And again, this is designed to help foster a conversation between those three people in terms of what they want to focus on for that feature. So it is not a minimal viable story. When I think about stories and in that language minimal viable, I think about how teams want to see requirements in such a way that they can execute on them. I know some teams that want a lot of flexibility in terms of how they're constructing things. They know their platforms very well. They know their end users very well. Their vision of a minimal viable story is fairly thin. They don't need a lot of detail around it because they want to be innovative and they want the empowerment to deliver something based on their collective vision. I have other groups that get very specific in terms of I need to see a wireframe, I need to see a design, I want the APIs blessed by an architect, I need non-functional criteria around security and performance, and they get a lot more specific in terms of what a minimal viable story is. And so, you know, I talked earlier about where you have standards in place. And so, you know, this is an area that larger organizations have to talk about. You know, if it's a new capability being launched in beta, you know, maybe you're going to give a very advanced team a lot of flexibility and your minimal viable story is going to be very thin compared to a team working on a high volume, high security, high reliability system being used by hundreds of thousands of users with a lot of at stake, and the organization wants more specificity around the requirements around that. So I think it's highly variable how you think about that. Gene, I think I got three. What were the other two? There was
let me just quickly toggle to those. So yeah, so there was one I think I try to address about JIRA workflows and discussions. I think it's a fair ask, but we're not going to ask you to reply to that. Some people are saying that burn-up charts are better than burn-down charts. Do you agree? Again, this is metrics basic Scrum question, but perhaps you want to take this. It's a fair ask.
You know, I to answer the question specifically, I don't have an opinion on burn up versus burn down. I think, to me, the real question here is, can you get enough of a backlog and a story in the tools that you're using so that you can see multiple sprints out, that you believe in the accuracy of the reporting that those reports are giving you, and that you can foster a dialogue around them. You know, the two anti-patterns I see around this is teams that do just-in-time planning, so any kind of burn up or burn down is useless. That's problematic. And I think the other problem is if I have to take data out of my tool, you know, whether it's an Agile tool or, you know, a dashboard in Tableau, whatever it is, if I have to take that out and put it into PowerPoint and tell a story by manipulating that data in a presentation, to me, that's also a problem. So, you know, depending on the nature of what tools you have and what you're accustomed to, I think they both can be used very equally to see where teams are at with their releases and epics.
Yep, I just may want to add, if for whatever it's worth, this is a very mechanical question. Burn up, burn down. If someone is interested, with a burn down, there's a floor because there was a x-axis that it's at 0 level. With a y, burn up, there is none. Probably has nothing to do with Scrum or Agile. It's more of how you measure something. You want it to see go up or down, but ultimately in the end it's the same thing. One question that came in for you, Isaac, I will probably excuse you from answering it. I think this is a beat up topic. You know, compare less and safe. I mean,
oh boy,
not going to probably do this here because there's so much out there, and frankly, if you don't have in-depth expertise, nor do you claim on less, then it wouldn't be unfair to ask you of this compare and contrast. But I can tell you, probably comparing safe to less would not be appropriate. Safe and RUP, maybe. Less and Nexus and Scrum at Scale, maybe, but not these two. So there was one question that I think you may want to answer. It's fair. It's a fair ask. any thoughts about whether Agile will favor teams working from home at scale? So I'm not sure if it has to do with the very unfortunate situation we're all in at the moment, and we all have to be remote.
No, I think it's a great question. I actually just finished and submitted an article to InfoWorld just on that. I actually think there's a third question around this because, a lot of Scrum is written from the language of let's get co-located teams. They have the best collaboration and communication. We don't have to schedule meetings. We don't have to use tools. And I think most of us have been on teams that are not co-located 100%. We've had teams that are distributed. We've had teams with freelancers. And, if some of you are Scrum Masters, the first thing you're figuring out is where's the team? What are their skill sets? What are their communication styles? How do they like to work? How do I get people in the same tool, whether it's a physical whiteboard, a digital whiteboard, to be able to do some collaboration? Now, what this is doing to us, over the last week, is taking teams that have been used to working a certain way, whether it's physical or on tools, or a mix of it, and saying we're all working very differently. If you take a team that's got 3 people in an office and 2 other people in another office and a third person working remotely, 6 people, and now they're all working remotely. I don't think your process changes, and that's what I said in the article, but your tools and your mechanics change. The type of work you're going to take on is going to be a little bit different. Your velocity, at least in the early sprints, is going to be impacted. And, teams need to take a step back and say, let's revisit how we're collaborating. Let's make sure we're signing up for realistic stories that we can execute on, given that we're learning a new way of working. Let's make sure our stakeholders know that our ability to deliver is going to be somewhat hampered as we figure this out. But let's also commit and use our retrospectives to say, we don't know if this is going to be 2 weeks or 12 weeks or longer. And figuring out another way of working is what we're doing. We're agile, right? So we're going to figure this out, and use the tools at hand, and use the dynamics at hand to as best as we can to deliver. So I think it's actually a very relevant question, and I'm not sure when that article is going to be published, but I gave 7 different points about how agile teams that are now working very differently have to think about everything from what you're signing up to how you're collaborating.
Thank you for that. So there's some comments about, some references to great articles about the author called Zhuang. So some good stuff out there. There's one long question. You see it as well. I'll paraphrase it. Have you seen cases where the original vision was incomplete or missed things that were important to the stakeholders due to the lack of human-centered design techniques such as in-context immersion, structured stakeholder interviews, focus, okay, blah, blah, blah. Have you seen this phenomenon frequently, especially in government context? Well, that assumes that you work for the government, or leading to large amounts of wasted effort. So I'm not sure if you are able to answer this question.
Oh, I definitely can answer this one. I have less of a government context, but look, I made a comment earlier that the reason BRDs and documents failed is we don't fully know what end users need. We don't, we're fooled to think we can write perfect requirements, and the art of Scrum in particular is we're narrowing down requirements to small user stories that we're executing on much shorter timeframes. On the top end, we focus on vision statements and then breaking those down in epics and so forth. But, those vision statements will also require recalibrating. And hopefully that's not recalibrating every sprint, but I guarantee you every business that's doing Agile today needs to look at whatever they're using as strategy and vision for the next 3 to 12 months and probably needs to recalibrate it. So I do think that's a fact of what we are working on and how we work. I do think there's a couple things to understand. When I talked about agile principles, one of the things that I think needs to get discussed is, if you think about the original golden triangle that used to be part of the PMI, what are you going to put as a priority? Is it quality? Is it timeliness, releasing on time? Is it scope? Which is the first thing you're going to anchor down on? And so for most organizations, I recommend that they focus on time. Be consistent about saying when you're releasing software and hitting those dates, and using the time between now and then to be able to negotiate around scope. And it's largely because my history in most situations is that scope is negotiable. We don't have the perfect requirements up front, and that we can make adjustments as we learn and understand feasibility. There are some organizations, some that are very user experience focused. I had one client that was highly user experience focused, and they said to me, Isaac, we're willing to have delayed releases, but we need to get the user experience right. And I suspect government is also in a category of, we need to get the requirements right, we need to get our stakeholders involved right, and we're willing to take some delays occasionally to be able to do that well. So I think you have to understand that part of your organization about what are you really anchoring on as part of your strategy for delivery. And then after that, I think it's really about the team coming together and making good decisions about where to cut corners, where that's applicable, and where, you have to hunker down and figure out how to put more effort around something, how to find technologies that help you accelerate your ability to deliver things. Where do you put training in place? And, someone asked, I think one of the questions I missed was about automation, right? A lot of times automation helps you take manual work out of your developer's time, and that time can go back into being able to execute more, right? So if you're finding your teams are doing a lot of manual testing at the end of a sprint or at the end of a release, automating that testing is one way to reduce that work and effort, and being able to put that back into actually building your product out. So that's why that's particularly relevant. So Gene, I think I went all over the place, but I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, I think you've covered the gist. I think you answered the core question. There are more questions. Some answers are. I'm sorry. Some more questions are rolling in. I'm just doing a quick time check. It's 5 minutes to 1. We got 5 more minutes. There's one that's simple. I like for short. I look for short, concise questions so that it's easy for you to digest.
Sure.
Do you include technical debt when you do your initial estimates? May require more interpretation. What a person considers as a technical debt, it could be more than just a bug. It comes in various forms, but take it at face value, if you will.
That actually is a question with a long answer, but I'll try to keep it simple. I think technical debt needs to be addressed. I think it needs to be a percentage of the delivery that every team is doing. My benchmark for this starts at 30%. You can ping me after why I start with 30%. Sometimes that can be done in the context of a story. Particularly if it's code level. So, right, so you're delivering a story and your acceptance criteria says we're going to fix this area of the code at the same time. A lot of times when you really think about technical debt and going upscale and really thinking about legacy, right? I'm replacing a library, refactoring a module of code. When it starts getting into that area, technical debt could be a feature, it could be an epic, it could be an entire team set of work that's really working to address an area of the code. And, at that level, I think about, who's responsible for specifying the backlog around technical debt. How is technical debt prioritized? What types of metrics you're using to help you do that? and who's accountable in terms of those decision making around technical debt, the same way I hold a product owner accountable around features and capabilities. So those are a lot of the things that I talk about. I do have some articles on this. So whoever asked the question, if you want some more information on tech debt, ping me on Twitter, or it's NY Ike on Twitter, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Is another place. It's Isaac Sikolik on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share you some posts I've done on that.
All right. So Isaac, I'm actually taking a close look at the clock. So we got 2 minutes until the hour. I would like to do a wrapping statement real quick so that we don't go over because people start dropping. First of all, thank you very much for joining, and thanks for sharing your
Thank you.
perspective. And as I mentioned before, I'll say it again. This is not necessarily less specific talk. Many of the topics we touched upon today are included in less experiments, but the presentation was not from a standpoint of a less practitioner or coach or trainer. So I'm actually replying to another offline comment that was sent across. Needless to say, I think I heard you and I learned quite a bit from what your experience was. Thank you again, Isaac. I will ask you if you can socialize your presentation with me so that I can make it available with the crowd. In fact, if you can upload it somewhere and just send me the link, I will make sure it's public. Okay?
Okay.
And the video will be zapped and will be made available in the next day or two as well. Some people were asking about the recording of this.
Okay. Yeah, definitely the recording. And thank you again for having me on here. And good luck to everybody. I know the world's changed a little bit over the last few weeks.
Just in that,
stay healthy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, please be safe, be careful, and unfortunately, for the sake of everyone's safety, we're trying to step up virtual activity even more. So there will be more events. Please stay tuned. There will be some virtual training coming up as well. So the community will be made aware of this. Okay. Thanks everyone again for joining, folks. And Isaac, to you as well. I will be ending the meeting and then we'll start recording in the cloud automatically.
Okay. Have a good one, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.